Hey friends, a real quick message before we get into this episode. Frankly, I need your help. If you found any of the episodes here on the Maker's Playbook podcast to be of value in helping you figure out this crazy dream of making a living from the things we make, whether it's been pragmatic help for how to actually sell your work, or equally important, the emotional help in hearing someone else's story and realizing that you are not alone in pursuing this dream. Whatever it has been, if you think you've gotten even just $5 worth of value from listening to our episodes, would you please consider making a small contribution to sustain this show? I love bringing these stories to your headphones, and I want to keep doing it for a very long time. But in order to do so, well, we need your financial support, no matter how small. There's a link in the show notes to make a one-time donation, or if you feel you get at least $4 worth of value from almost all the episodes, there's a sustaining subscription option, which, in turn for your support, gives you access to ask your questions of our podcast guests in advance. Just like your local public radio needs a membership drive once a year, this is ours. This announcement will not stay here forever, I promise. But we're doing this membership drive without the mass-produced swag to convince you to donate, because I'm pretty sure you did not want a store-bought mug with a logo on it anyway. Thank you so much in advance. Now let's get on with this episode. There is no subtle introduction for this episode, at least not if you read the title. Because I'm pretty sure seeing the word financial immediately creates a lot of different feelings. Maybe feelings of exhaustion, overwhelm, guilt, questions of worth, or something else that's probably less than happy. When it comes to the topic of money, for many of us, it stirs up not so great feelings. But in many ways, money is just data. Yeah, it has an outsized effect on our lives and the decisions that we make or can make, and that is as annoying as stepping on Legos. But as much as we can feel a variety of emotions around money, finances are actually neutral data points, just there for us to track, recognize, and make decisions that do actually work for ourselves uniquely based upon that data. Now, believe me, I know it's not actually that simple, but technically, it sort of is. Before we dig into today's episode with our very own community member, Seanin Rosario, a part-time potter and full-time financial professional, I want to acknowledge that talk of money can bring up a lot of mental junk for all of us. So before we get into what the heck we even mean by a financial system or financial playbook, if you will, before we do all of that, I want you to take a nice, big, deep breath in and out. It is okay if you aren't where you want to be with your finances right now. And it is okay if, maybe, even for years, you've buried your head in the sand when it comes to talk of money or systems or spreadsheets or any of this. If even just saying these words feels like too much, it is okay. And it is also something we can tackle together, one step at a time, in a way that actually works for us as makers, independent artists, and all around visually minded people, probably more than math and spreadsheet minded people. And we can do it without the accounting jargon of P&L sheets, or frankly, without even QuickBooks. Because the depths of which I hate QuickBooks really knows no bounds, I promise you. This conversation I had with Seanin happened in the middle of her and I working on putting together a masterclass that's coming up on January 20th inside of the community. All about, obviously, financial systems for makers. To put it transparently, we did not have everything finished before we recorded this conversation. In fact, that was sort of the whole point. Just like I did back with our Instagram masterclass last summer with pro strategist Allie Mason, first we took questions from our members, which you're going to hear on this episode. And of course, we got to learn the answers from Seanin, also which you're going to hear on this episode. And then, having learned about what would be actually most helpful for fellow makers, and not just for my brain, we have been building out a custom masterclass and a custom spreadsheet. I've got to tell you, as weird as this might sound, this spreadsheet is a thing of beauty. I mean, it's the kind of resource that you would normally have to pay someone literally hundreds of dollars to create for you. And I cannot freaking wait to see how our fellow makers put this to use and be able to make more informed decisions for themselves. But now I'm getting ahead of myself. The point of mentioning this all now is that if getting control of your side hustle or small business finances was on the 2025 New Year's resolution list, or if this conversation piques your interest and you want to go further, then be sure to come join us inside of the community for Seanin's masterclass on January 20th. And of course, if you're listening to this after the 20th, or if that annoying day job keeps you from joining live, don't worry. There will be a recording, and there will also be heaps of follow-up conversations alongside the Q&A hangouts that I'm scheduling and co-working sessions to actually implement these things. That's part of why I love the platform we use for the community so darn much. There's opportunities for live conversation if that works for you, but also plenty of asynchronous chats happening with members from all around the globe. And actual support to take action on the things that we learn about from other professionals. No more passively listening to an expert teaching you about something that you should be doing, only to say, wow, that was great, that was so helpful, but then not actually doing anything. The community is the very tagline of this show personified. Together, we've got this. Visit makersplaybook.com/community to join us, join the upcoming Financial Systems Masterclass, get this amazing spreadsheet, and tons of always growing additional resources to help you move forward on making your own unique version of this dream, making a living from the things we make, a reality for your specific life. Oh, and yes, clearly, this episode is sponsored by the community because the cost of membership helps support the hard costs of creating this very show. So that means now, on with the show. Welcome to the Maker's Playbook, the show where we talk all about what it's really like to make a living from the things you make. I'm your host, seasoned entrepreneur of 14 years, Rebecca Ikis Kara.
That is a motto. I say progress over perfection to my staff all the time, right? Make progress. Don't get hung up on don't doing it. I'm not doing it just because it's not going to be perfect.
Better. Actually, progress over perfection is better than done over perfect because progress doesn't mean that you have to be done.
No, you're just taking a step.
I feel like we have already started this without my saying, hey, Seanin, welcome to the podcast.
How funny. How funny. Well, that is another. Look, I have a sticky note from COVID here, and it said, perfect can't get in the way of progress. It truly, that's how it started, and then I shortened it.
I love it. I love it. I feel like this is a long time coming. This may be, and people are going to get tired of hearing me say, like, a long time coming, and you're somebody I talk to the most. But this might go even further than when I said that with Bill, because we have shared an Airbnb together. So, like, you've seen me in the morning, which is, just a whole next up. You've seen me get sick, actually. I got sick at the end of that trip.
I know, that was sucky suck.
The most disappointing part, to be fair, was not getting to try all the wine you and Antonio brought to Sika.
Oh my god. What were we thinking?
We're gonna make the cover photo, the artwork of this episode, the picture I took of that suitcase.
Oh, we still have the suitcase, yes. Yes.
I love it.
We haven't used it since. I'm sure we will, because we have a trip that we'll be going on, and that's why Nsika's in question, because we have a trip we're going on in May. So I think the suitcase might make its way back out again.
Well, before we get into how to transport wine domestically over commercial airlines, how would you introduce yourself in the world of making, but also maybe in the professional sense? Both apply for this.
Oh, both. Well, Seanin Rosario, and I am both a ceramic artist and a finance professional. So I started ceramics in college. Funny story, I went to University of Colorado Boulder, and my ceramics teacher's name was Tom Potter.
No.
Yeah, yeah, it was. I learned from Tom Potter. And I'll tell you, coincidentally, the assistant professor, her name is Julia Galloway, who is very heavily involved with Nsika. So it's been nice to connect with her again. And I did pottery for like 7 years and then had to go on in the career path. So I followed a career of being an accountant, being a finance professional, budget, forecasting, all of the things finance, had very high level roles in organizations in finance. And then a few years ago, I remembered that I needed some balance. And so I picked the clay back up and was shocked when I could center way quicker than I thought I was going to. There is muscle memory even after 20 years. And I remember sitting in a beginner class at the rec center and I was like, oh, this is my first class. And I centered and like pulled, and the guy across me was like, and I said, well, no, I just haven't done it for 20 years.
I was going to say, you made 0 friends in that first class.
I didn't realize that it was going to come back that easy. I did feel awful. I moved on from beginning pottery pretty quick after that because not that I'm amazing, but they were not happy with me.
They were like, get out of here.
We don't want to watch you. So now I just really, really try to keep the balance that way. I always thought it was like this irony of being creative with pottery and being this strong analytical mind, with finance. And then now that I've gotten older, I'm like, you know what? The creative mind, it does work its way into finance because you can try to think about what do I need to accomplish, and you can be creative on how to get there. So there's still that process of making something work. It's just different. It's not the clay.
I agree completely. I don't know how many people have told me, oh, I'm not creative. I could never do. And it's like there are so many different like businesses creative. Everything is creative and it just looks different, I think. Yeah.
Problem solving is creativity. It's just like two sides of the same coin, right?
And also color-coded spreadsheets are just more functional in my life.
Yes, color has meaning and it can give you some indication of what to do. So, yeah, absolutely.
If a cell is red, that's not a good thing.
Don't go there.
I love it. Well, how long, I'm just curious, how long was kind of the timeline between starting back into clay, like taking that beginner class, and what I know now that nobody else knows yet, of like setting up the home studio, and as far as you've taken it all now?
Probably like a year and a half. So I still had my wheel. I have a Brent Model C that I had way back then, and it had sat and sat, hadn't been covered, hadn't been taken care of. And I turned it on and it still worked. So after my first class, I bought clay at the rec center and brought it home and just started playing again. And, that goes back to that first. I did a studio tour in your community, and it was that little furnace room, that itty bitty furnace room. And then, lucky for me, my husband then said, we're taking down the wall and creating a whole space for you so that you can go down and do your thing, which was really nice. And then definitely helped kind of propel it forward from there. Because then I'm like, I can't waste the space.
I don't think he knew that he would also then be joining in for like 3-day conferences with clay people.
No, not at all. But he has fun.
Right? I think he actually attended more talks than I did this past year at Nsika, because I get caught up talking in the hallway or something and then realize I've missed half of a presentation, but he's like really good about it.
Yeah, no, I don't know, he's been great. And I think the first one, he's like, whatever, I might have to go back to the Airbnb and just do work. And then he stayed like all day and he's like, ah, this is cool. This is different. So
Right?
he likes the clay people.
We're good people. What can I say? Well, we could be nostalgic for ages about all the antics of Finsika, but I will avoid that and get more to the point of chatting a little bit. I kind of strong armed you into this. I will admit that publicly. But we got to chatting about the financial side of making and of pottery and of not just for people who are trying to go full time and figure out like finances when it comes to can I do this? Am I making enough? And or like the legality of filing taxes, but also kind of the more holistic, like, I don't know, is this financial wellness in a like
Ooh,
right? We're going to get woo on the finances. I'm not sure. But I don't remember how the conversation started, but it definitely got going. I'm pretty sure Antonio convinced you that you should do this. And here we are.
yeah. He advocated on my behalf. I do think he did. I was staring at him while he was doing that.
You were
What are you
staring,
saying?
glaring, tomato, tomato. Where to even begin on this huge subject that I have a feeling makes a lot of potters cringe and want to hit the advance button on their podcast player. But it doesn't have to be that bad, I feel like.
No.
And I should also, before we get into it, I feel like I should give our official disclaimer. As you said before we hit record, you are not a CPA. This is not officially legal advice. Consult someone in your own state, country, county, what have you, when it comes to actual like taxes with a capital T.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. But we can try to be thoughtful once you know the legalities around the taxes, then to be thoughtful about how we get you there in a way that, like I said, doesn't make you cringe the whole time.
Right. Well, because we got to chatting about like there's a difference between what you need to know about your numbers for the legality side for taxes. And also, what I found really interesting was the questions you were asking of like, what do you actually want to know? Because the ideas you came up with and the ideas I came up with were totally different, which is fascinating.
Which is great. Yeah, for sure. No, I think it is. It's about like thinking about what the output is. So what are the key, what's important to you? What's the output that you're really trying to get? And kind of to your point, what decisions is it going to help you make? So if we can kind of narrow in on those kind of things, then it's easier to build some financial model that supports that, right? If you do the tracking up front with the right performance indicators or whatever that we want to put as input into the model, then we can make it easy for the output to be there and easy to digest or hand off to a finance professional.
And when you talk about models, are you mostly thinking of like the only thing my brain goes to is spreadsheets? Are there other things I'm not thinking about?
No, and I think the simplest is spreadsheets just because in general everybody has access to Google Sheets or Excel or something easy that way. But I know when you and I talk, there's other applications out there that are free applications. I think you talked about that Wave application, which looks really good in the sense of how it's trying to structure your data in a way to then give you displays at the end to help you make decisions. So I think it could be any of those things. I'm sure there's way many other models out there. It's just how far you want to go down that path or if you want to keep it simple.
Yeah, because for me, what I find to be the most helpful for my own brain is completely different than what I actually need to track and use to submit for taxes at the end of the year. Wave apps, which is what we use for bookkeeping, but for us, that's what we use for like the legal side of things, for putting expenses into categories and creating something like a profit and loss sheet. Whereas when I look at a profit and loss sheet for myself to understand, okay, what's the health of the business? How are we doing? Is everything going to be okay? It means nothing to me.
Well, it's going to also depend on how you want to define the health too, right? Because I think there's many things. I know one of the CFOs that I worked with early in my career, he said the cash flow statement is the most important statement to give you the financial health of the organization because it is showing you, depending on how you build it, it can show you where's your largest sources of revenue, where have they been, what's your largest sources of expense, and then modeling that in a way looking forward so that you can really see what's going to be in your bank account in 6 months. So I think that the cash flow is super important. And it really does give you that sense of where you're heading, as long as those inputs, that revenue and that expenses, reflecting reality of some level. So you have to still, you can't just say, oh, I'm going to make, $5,000 a month and not adjust it if the last 3 months you've only made $2,000. So unless you know of something specific that's going to change, then you might need to be adjusting your model going forward to see where does that end up with that different revenue level. Or if you know something's coming up, right? Maybe it's $2,000 a month. And then that, right now in the crunch of the holiday season, last year you made $5,000. So, you can bump it up in October, November, December to reflect that. So I think it's that interactive model that can do that for you and then help you look forward. So it's not just looking backwards, which taxes want to do. They're just looking backwards, but it's also looking forwards and seeing what does it look like coming in the near future.
That's a really fantastic delineation, and probably why I always thought the documents and the systems for taxes and for the legality wasn't really helpful because, yeah, it is like taxes by nature are historical. And if you're trying to make a decision for yourself, you're trying to make a decision for something yet to come, right? Like, can I quit my job? Do I make enough with pottery or whatever you're making to sustain this, or all of those things? That's like yet to come.
No, for sure. And I think if you're sitting there in that place of saying, can I quit, quit my job and do this full time, then it's really sitting down, I think, with yourself to say, well, what does that mean? And starting with the backwards plan, right? Because you got to say, okay, so currently I make X. And so do I still need to continue to make X? And if that's the case, back into it because you're going to have to then back into saying that's what you need left over after you buy the clay, after you buy a kiln, if you have to buy a kiln, or firing time at a community studio, or rent expense if you're going to rent a studio somewhere. Like all of those things, you got to charge for what you're going to sell and then take out all those expenses and hope that what's left over is the same as what you're making today. That's going to take, it's going to take assumptions. And I think the best part about that is I always say, within the organizations we work with, is those assumptions are almost like your playbook because you're saying, here's what I assume. I assume I'm going to sell this much or I'm going to make this much, and here's what I'm going to spend the money on. So when 2 or 3 months it's not coming out as you projected, you can go back to that playbook and say, what plays did I think I was going to make that maybe I didn't, and it's going to explain why I'm off track.
Yeah, I enjoy the metaphor of a playbook. Clearly.
I I thought of that as it came. I always say playbook, but as it came out of my mouth, I was like, "Oh, that was a coincidence."
I love it. Oh, I love it. Well, before we keep going, I want to back up just a little bit because I realized we started using a term that I have a cash flow spreadsheet that I've used for probably over a decade that a CPA I worked with for just as long as that time made for me, but I think is not like such a complicated thing that somebody couldn't just make for themselves, even if they're not super comfortable with spreadsheets. But it has informed so many decisions. I mean, I'm still using it and the business is completely different now. It's not even the same thing, right? So let's back up a little bit before we get further. And
Yeah,
is there a definition to a cash flow system?
I don't know. That's so hard to describe without looking at a spreadsheet. But a cash flow truly is like watching the cash come in and out, hence, cash flow. So it does look historically, you can say at the beginning of the month, I had X dollars in my cash or my savings account. Here's the additional money that was added into the account during the month. Here's the expenses I had for the month. And now here's my ending balance. And truly, like if you just look at it for 1 month, that is your cash flow for the month, the beginning balance plus your revenue, less your expenses, ending balance. So you can do that as a tracking mechanism historically. And then, like I said, going forward, you can always carry that ending balance. So ending balance of last month is the beginning balance of this month. Now let's project, what do I think I'm going to make this month? Again, you can look at those prior 6 months and say, what's realistic? And what do I think I'm going to spend? Or is there, is this the month I have to purchase more clay? Map that out. And then you can project what's my ending cash balance going to be at the end of next month. You can keep doing that for months going forward and to give that kind of projection look at the business to see if that's how you want to define, the health of the business is to make sure you have money in the cash account.
Yeah. And for me, it was always, I think the reason I wanted to come back to it was also much like photography, pottery for us is very seasonal. We're not selling nearly as many pieces in March as we are in November. And having a document to be able to kind of plot out looking in the future, to your point, we keep using the word projection, which is effectively just an educated guess to say, like, I hope or I think that this is a reasonable number of what we might make each month for the next 12 months. And being able to kind of see, okay, what does that do for what is a very real checking account, right? So you've got one line that is like, okay, that's the actual money in the bank. And then the next line is like, this is what I think I'm going to do
Hmm.
based upon historical data or based upon guesses, because you have no historical data, depending on where you're at. But then being able to see, like, oh, okay, come January, maybe there's not that much cash available because you actually need 50% of it to get you through until April when you have your first market.
Market. Yeah, for sure.
Something like that. Because otherwise, I think it was, I just forgot the name of the author who wrote the book Profit First, but he was basically saying, all of our tendency is just to open up your banking app and look at the checking account and be like, is there money? Okay, cool, we're fine.
I can go
Which
shopping.
is exactly like tricky. I think anybody might understand this in a much smaller concept if you just think about like the 2 weeks in between paychecks for people that are traditionally employed, right? Like the day after payday, everything feels awesome. Day number 12, maybe everything feels less awesome, and then you go through this cycle again.
Nope, that's totally true. And I think seasonality is definitely part of it that you got to think about. And with most organizations that I've been a part of, just even from a larger sense, you got to understand those rhythms of your business to understand how that is going to impact either, what has happened or what's going to happen going forward and try to model it in there. But I do think that there's different ways of estimating what you think is going to happen because you could say, I think what's going to happen is the average, and again, it's a Excel language, so you can build it in an Excel spreadsheet. I think what's going to happen is the average of the prior 6 months. So you can always have that formula perpetuate going forward, and then it'll adjust as you update your actuals. Or you can say, because there's seasonality, April of this year is going to be the same as April last year. Even make that as your assumption in your spreadsheet to project with that to at least give you a model that helps you indicate where you think you're headed. But I think it's truly about, understanding the rhythms, understanding that cash inflow, where is it coming from, understanding your cash outflow, understanding the primary drivers. I don't believe that you need to track every single expense, but you need to understand 90% of them because that's really the ones that are going to make or break your cash flow. The other ones are probably not as, you don't have to track to that detail. It's the big ones that you really need to think about when you're modeling something out like that.
And for me, the thing that it did was really let me make decisions for my own well-being, like separate from the money, right? Like in the sense of because our work is so seasonal, I think a lot of times it can feel like when the requests are coming in, you want to say yes to all of them because I get that feeling at least of like, well, everybody wants our work now. Maybe tomorrow they won't, so we better say yes, and especially a couple of years ago for me in kind of balancing Maker's Playbook and photography clients and all of that, it was this point of, I had open dates on the books. I could take on more work, but I could also look at the cash flow spreadsheet and say like, okay, we're going to be okay for the next 6 months. And I am absolutely exhausted right now. So even though I have the date this person is requesting available, I'm actually going to say no. And I could do that quote unquote safely. Now this was like 4 years ago. Maybe now I wish I took the job. But in that moment though, I knew I could do that and not feel like I was turning away, I don't know, perfectly good money or something like that. It was more about my own wellness rather than just the financial wellness of the business. But I had that peace of mind in looking at a cash flow spreadsheet. which is, people are going to think I'm weirder than they already thought with the sentence. I just,
No, but I think no, but I think you're right. I was thinking as you were saying that it is. It's that also sometimes you have to say no to say yes to something else. And so, sure, to take on, for instance, like a commission. But if you take the commission and say that's going to be my revenue when I complete the commission in this month, but I'm going to have to be making every single weekend to get this commission done. Therefore, I'm gonna miss 3 markets because I would be making those weekends. You gotta balance that out, and without that kind of understanding of those are all different cash inflows, and now we're saying yes to this one, but we're gonna have to say no to this. What does that look like? Is it really beneficial in the long run? So I do think that those kinda looking forward and playing out those scenarios is helpful in trying to assess where you're at.
I think the other part of it for me too was when was it when I first started, or do I still sometimes feel this way? Let's be transparent. A lot of people remind us all how scary being self-employed can be, right? Like
Oh,
there's
yeah.
this sense of the fact that there's less security. And sometimes that can be true. This is the point in the podcast where I always talk about healthcare. Sometimes that can be true, but other times it might not be, because I remember, what year was it? Maybe 2015-ish, somewhere in there, when a Chicago newspaper overnight literally laid off their entire photo staff. Now, did the people in that department see it coming? From the people I talked to, it sure seemed like no,
Oh.
because can you imagine a newspaper not having any photographers? How does that work? So when that moment happened, I realized with something like the cash flow spreadsheet and kind of having your hands on long-term information, you actually have, in a weird way, more security because I know what's coming. I know what month right now, in the fact that we're in that transition period, we're in the like sink or swim period of Maker's Playbook. I don't have any wedding clients. I know what month, if I don't bring in other revenue, that we're at a point where it's like, well, that was nice. Time to go back and get a job.
Yeah.
As opposed to like if I was traditionally employed, I wouldn't, unless I worked in finance, I don't think I'd really have a clue as to the health of the organization. I,
Yeah.
I mean, culturally, I guess if everybody's griping in the break room, but I don't know.
Well, and I like it was funny you were saying that, and I was thinking, you have it in your control because I think, and especially for you, because you have multiple, what I would call like service lines of revenue. So you know which levers you have that you can pull or put the brakes on to try to help drive it. So you do have control in that. Whereas if people are just declining significantly, I'm buying newspapers and suddenly we just don't need a photography department. There was nothing in those people's control to even give them an idea of how they could change that trajectory. So it's too bad. But I do think, yeah, understanding which of those levers you have control of and what the impact is on your business financially.
What do you feel like would be levers for someone who's just making the work and trying to sell the work? Pottery, paintings, jewelry, whatever it might be. Because obviously I'm special.
Yes, of
I
course
mean,
you are.
I mean that in the most sarcastic way possible for anyone listening who couldn't see my face.
Awesome. I think we talk about it in rate and quantity analysis. And why am I failing on what that term should be? Sorry. But when you're doing analysis, like if we're doing analysis on something and we're looking at there's a variance, the reason there's a variance is either something happened more or less than expected, or the amount happened more or less. So I think it's really that, the quantity that you sell and the rate at which you sell it, but same for expenses. So I think the primary driver of financial activity for somebody that's only focused on pottery is going to be the number of pieces. So it's either the number of pieces sold or the number of pieces produced. And each of those has an associated revenue or expense attributed to it. So that's the biggest levers that you can control. But then it's all that other businessy stuff to say, how can I influence to, more people to buy this? Or how can I assess what's the most popular color that's going to sell so that then I know that I'm putting more of my energy into selling that color versus sampling ones that people are not as attracted to. So there's the sideline things that you can still do, but I think it really comes down to what you're producing and how much you're selling it for and how much it costs you to produce it.
I think and people are going to hear this and think like, I just want to make what I want to make and not worry about it. And I hear that, but I think that's probably the big difference between it being a hobby that you happen to make a little bit of money from versus it being something that is what you're paying all of your household is reliant on, so to speak. Which maybe that sounds harsh, but I think, there's some of the reality between needing to be aware of what people are interested in a certain sense. Not to completely take away a person's creativity, but to be strategic, I guess, with your time, right? Like, can you look at numbers like this? If you start to track them, can you look at them and then say, oh, okay, I can now focus, whatever percentage of my time making these two things that sell really well, even though I don't love them that much, because that will free up my time to make more of the thing that I do love, even though economically maybe that's not the savvy thing, but that's what lights you up, as opposed to spending a little bit of your time on like 50 different things, half of which you kind of like, but not that much, and like 10 things you really like, and being stretched thin, I guess. Does that make
Yep,
sense? Do you feel like that's what
totally.
you would do?
Yeah, no, that I would absolutely do that. I think that's the stuff that I do track is yes, I mean, I inherently know what I enjoy to do, but I also know what stuff doesn't seem to sell. So it doesn't mean I'm going to stop doing what I enjoy doing, but if I want to break even, which is really my goal, then I need to balance. And I think, you can also balance it with thinking about your time. And that's what I see some potters doing is saying, if I throw the mugs this day and then do something a bowl this day, then by the third day now I can put the handles on the mugs and try to stagger your work to be efficient to try to continue production versus me that's only on the weekends. But it's also then seeing what's I don't know if it's the value is the right word, but the consumers, what products do they value and that do they want to purchase, and then understand like how does that make up part of your revenue. So for me, I would look at all the things that I make, which ones, not just from a quantity perspective, sell the most, but which ones generate the most dollar amount. Because can you make, X number of vases that sell for $100 in less time than you can make, however many mugs, and those are $40 each. Like if it takes the same amount of time for them, but the one actually sells at $100, you're probably going to want to invest more time in that one.
That example you just gave reminds me perfectly of kind of the experiment Francesco and I have been running in terms of, do we have to bring mugs to markets? Now, to be fair, we didn't have the greatest market in December ever, but when we think about the sales we did do, and we literally didn't take a single mug, for anybody else out there who moans the idea of pulling handles, it's pretty awesome to be able to realize, like, hey, we can make a bunch more bud vases or a bunch more spoon rests and make up for, however many mugs, like a third of the mugs that we could have taken or whatever. I don't know what the numbers are. I don't have them in front of me, but that's what we've been doing. And it's like bud vases are so much more fun because we're not worried about them all matching, and he can kind of explore shapes and save ideas and, kind of, it's a huge selling item for us that is basically just playing and sketching rather than the usual production work too.
Yeah, well, and true. Like if it takes twice as long to make a mug, which is probably at least, probably it's 3 times as long to do a mug than a bud vase, and they sell for an equal price point, yeah, and you can sell those bud vases, yeah, I would definitely put my money in the bud vases. So I agree with what you did for December. That makes sense.
The other kind of financially related thing, I guess this has less to do with systems, but, for people in general is something we've started doing is I got this from Kate Schrader, who talked about it back on whatever episode number she was I never pull up the episodes beforehand because I never know what I'm going to talk about. But she mentioned every time she sells out, you can just make a little increase, just a little bit. It doesn't have to be twice as much, or we just did it like by $1, basically. And that can that can take something up by $10 by the end of the year. A year ago, our Budweises were $10 less than they are. And it makes it less scary, too, for me. Like sometimes raising prices by a lot, like once a year, can be nerve wracking, where this way, nobody notices if something used to be $33 and now it's $35 or 52 or, whatever.
Well, and we're way more used to it right now, right? Like butter was this price in the grocery store 6 months ago, and now it's that price. And like, I don't even think I notice anymore. I don't even think I remember what eggs used to be priced at. I just know, I still need eggs, so I go and get them at the price that they're at. But I think about Kate a lot because I think she did such a great business model because she found those moms that people love, and she figured out a way to just like carve that out to be X% of her revenue stream so that then she carves so much time for those other more intricate things that she does, that I think that's ideal. If everyone could figure out that kind of niche of saying, this is the easy stuff and this is stuff people want, but I keep and preserve time for the other part of the creativity, and, model that forward to see how that financially works for you. I think that's brilliant.
I think a lot more people do that than we as artists who are in the thick of it, seeing their quote unquote artsy stuff, realize. I remember another conversation early days on the podcast with Lucy Fagella, who was saying she has an earns business, which is a separate name. And then all of her like exploratory, what she calls her art stuff, is under lucyfagella.com. But I'm sure most potters only know lucyfagella.com because those are the pots that potters are going to be interested in. But the Earns business is like crushing it.
Yeah, she probably does fine. I mean, I think that's ideal. If we could all kind of find that balance somewhere, that's ideal.
So, what would be for you? Wait, hold on. Let me back up. Because as we're talking about finding an item and kind of understand what people are interested in, it is a perfect segue to one of our community questions that Bill asked, because he wants to know the story behind your whiskey glasses, which are, for anybody who hasn't seen them, are very much that like Glencairn shaped
Hmm. Hmm.
classic. Anybody that knows anything about whiskey, like it's that shape, if that makes
It
sense.
is. It is. Well, you're probably going to love it because it's a good community story. So I'm Irish. My family's Irish. My family has partaked in whiskey throughout my life. So I was familiar with a Glencairn glass, but it's typically, glass. People want to see what's inside there. And then we did as a community, we did the studio tour with Connie Cole. And Connie was like, I was trying to do this shape. And if any of you want to try to do this shape, I would encourage you, because if you can get it I think there's a niche out there for it. And so I followed up with her and I'm like, you know what? I have one of these glasses in my house. I can put it in my studio and start making it. So that's really where it came from, is it was an idea from Connie, and she's like, go for it. I want you to have the shape. You just go for it. She's the most generous person anyway. So that was very nice of her to be like that. So it's worked out. They do take a while, but really the shape of that glass, because it has a big belly, which my hands aren't high enough, a big belly on the bottom, and then a neck. And it is almost like a mini bud vase, right? Because it just has this big belly on the bottom. And the science of it is that the aroma of the whiskey, then with the narrow neck on it, the aroma stays within that belly, so that for somebody that's really a whiskey drinker, as they tilt it up, then the aroma of the whiskey escapes as you tip the glass. And that's why there's a particular science to the shape.
That's awesome. My Belgian heritage half totally believes you on the science to the shape, because I'm fairly certain, if memory serves me correctly, Belgian beers all have their own glass to maximize every single beer, which is insane. There's a wall that has this all on display. I'm not making it up. Every beer gets served in a specific glass, so it smells, it tastes, and whatever. Or just so we buy more of it. I don't know.
Probably. They sell us on that and sell us on, well, if you smell it first before you taste it and whatever. Yes, I'm sure there's all of that to it. I am happy to say, yeah, there's been a couple people that have been repeat buyers of it because they just love the fact. I've thought potentially people wouldn't like it because it wasn't glass and you couldn't see the color of the whiskey. But I've had a few people that have bought a few from me because they actually enjoy the fact that it is a ceramic and a different experience of drinking whiskey out of it. So who knew?
I like it.
Yeah.
I like it. Well, all right. Getting back to, I have no segue, actually. This is just like a hard right turn from that. But getting back to our financial system side of it, what would be your suggestion for someone who's just starting, who's hearing this, maybe is a little overwhelmed, who's like, I have no data, I have no historical data. All you've talked about is kind of comparing. Where would you even kind of begin in the simplest of ways?
I would say step one for sure is get a separate checking slash savings bank account of whatever sort for your ceramic business and a credit card, either like a debit card associated with it or a credit card that's associated just for business purposes. I don't think you have to necessarily set up a whole business just to open an account. It can still be your own account. It can be all in your name. It's just a separate way that you can track the transactions. Because then easy is that, you can go to your bank website and you can get a summary. Most banks give that to you now to say, here's all your transactions and let me categorize your expenses into these high level categories so you can see what you're spending your money on. And same where you can get reports just straight from your bank. I would start there as this most simple and easy to navigate, and then just be diligent about always using that account for your revenue, for your expenses, and using that credit card the same way.
Agreed. And I do, at least in the US, I can't speak to other countries, and we are trying to keep this a broad conversation so it applies regardless of legality of countries. What we're saying, you don't have to have it be necessarily a business account at a bank, especially for someone who's doing this as a side hustle, who's, in the US, it would be a sole proprietor. So you don't have a federally recognized business entity, quote unquote. I'm sure there's another term in other countries that exist in some, there's people side hustling their hobbies in other countries. I just don't know what the terms are, but I'm sure it exists. But yeah, that's 100%. So, you could still get a personal checking account if that's more helpful at your bank, or, all the banks have all their different fee structures and all that nonsense. So you don't have to spend money on this type of thing.
Right. Well, I think just separating it for tracking purposes. And you never know, you might as well start there because it could still just remain a little hobby business and you're just breaking even with, the money you bring in covers the cost of your material and it's not, anything fancy. But what if, you're Kate and suddenly you make these mini malms and it takes off? Then you at least have step one done and you have everything separated. Yes, you will probably have to go consult a accountant or finance professional to say, now I think I'm in a range of that I'm going to need to report these sales and pay taxes and all of that. But you already have that done. So you might as well just get that step done.
Yep, absolutely. Because in a way, it's like everything could be a total mess, but if at least you have them in their own boxes, you only have one box to sort through instead of like a closet full.
Right. Well, and then sorting out, well, this is not anything related to it, right? You'd have to filter through all the transactions and say like, oh, well, I mean, even Amazon, right? You might be buying something on Amazon that's all for your personal stuff. And then a little bit of it was glaze or tools or something like that you purchased for ease through Amazon. You wouldn't want to have to go through that after the fact. That would be a mess.
That was my first example because it is so annoying that all of your transactions from, it just says Amazon.com. You don't know if that was a book you bought on glazing or, I don't know, a pair of socks. I don't know what else.
Or, Christmas present for your brother. No, you have no idea. I agree.
Yep.
So I think it's just safe.
We did the exact same thing with Lowe's because of all of our home projects. Well, some of those projects have been studio projects. That's a business expense. That's not a personal expense. We account for the percentage of our home that is specifically for work, and that can be something you can track and use for tax time. And so then, there's been times where it's like you check out once with a business card because you're buying all of this wood to build more shelves, and then you check out another time with a personal card because I needed paint for a bedroom or something. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But yeah, just starting that kind of segmentation, it can go a long ways. And just again, for that retro look, right? If you just want to say, hey, it's the end of 2024 and I honestly have no idea how much I sold. it's an easy way to just look back and at the account and be like, "Oh my gosh, that was way more than I anticipated."
For someone who's just even like starting to sell in the first place, Sarah asked, how would you make financial plans when you have no idea what you're going to make this year?
I think it's just start with the tracking to see what you're doing currently and then understand, similar to what we talked about earlier, understand or start identifying those levers of things that you have in your control about the variety of things you sell or the quantity or to generate revenue, just start getting an idea around that, but also around expenses. And then as you think about expenses, I mean, it might be the easy ones like how much am I paying for clay? Am I buying tools? What am I paying for products for glazing? Those kind of things. But, consider, is your time going to be part of those expenses that, and you have to decide if you're going to include your time as an expense. I would just start looking at them and think about that in a way that then helps you visualize going forward, how will these things be different? So, I mean, I don't have a great answer, but I think knowing current state is probably going to get you part of the way there in understanding which levers you can pull to going forward to adjust that cash flow or that current state.
It sounds to me like there's also there comes a point if you're listening to all of this and thinking, okay, all right, this is something I'm going to at least get started on. It's kind of like starting now is better than not starting at all, even if you're not going to be able to do all of the things we're talking about, right? Like in the first year, maybe you're not going to have any cash flow kind of spreadsheet or system because you don't have the information, but start gathering the information now, have a way to be able to track it. And for me, where my brain goes with that is whether that be, are you only going to do sales on Etsy? Are you only going to do sales on your own website? Or, knowing where those are coming from and having them be places where you can pull information relatively easily. That definitely was a factor in us deciding where to build our website on, because it was like, okay, we can do all of our market sales and our online sales in the same system. So all the data is there. Like I didn't have to build any kind of spreadsheet to be able to pull like how many bud vases did we sell at the December show? It's just already there.
I think that goes to what we talked about with the outputs. Like, what is important to you? Do you want, and I think it would be, but I can't say that judgment for everybody. I would think it would be important to be able to say what revenue is associated with markets, what's associated with Etsy, what's associated with, word of mouth. Somebody emails you and says, "Hey, so and so in my office has a mug. I'd love to buy a mug." Just keeping track of it, understanding that that's an output that you're going to want to use to help drive a decision means that then it's some sort of input that you should track at that level so you can get the information at the end.
Yeah. Oh gosh. That just reminded me of there was a year somewhere along the line with photography that I like went back to each client and I had booked. And I could do this because it wasn't like, if I had 20 couples in a year, that's not a huge amount of effort. If you're doing 20 transactions a week online, you're not really going to want to historically do this manually. But I went back and figured out where my best clients had come from. And it was shocking because I realized most of them were referrals from other photographers. And they weren't where I was putting all of my effort in, which was trying to network with caterers or planners, or everybody in the wedding industry thought planners were like, the end all be all, the keys to the kingdom, if you will. And then I realized like, oh, hold on a second. I should actually be spending all my effort over here because that's where the best people, the best clients, the best jobs I had gotten up to that point were from. And it completely changed how I spent my time.
So did you have data that you were already tracking and then you finally kind of reflected back on it to have that moment? Or was this just kind of more subjective that you were like, now that I think about the last couple customers, this is what it's been?
I made a list of like the last 2 or 3 years of customers because it wasn't, so many people. We're talking like, it was only for weddings. So we're talking like 40 to 60 people. So it was manageable. And then typically when someone first would send me a message to say like, hey, I'm interested to learn more, we had a contact form that they had to pick, how did you hear about us? And if it was word of mouth, then typically I could find in an email thread, like so-and-so told us to contact you. So it was a bit more manual than what you would want it to be moving forward, and that was definitely something then like, "Oh, okay, how can I save this data somewhere easier in the future?" But I think to the point we are starting to make, like, in the beginning, it is gonna be a little more manual just to get started.
Yeah, I definitely think so, and I think that's a great example. If you can think about that, that's going to be something that's important down the road to analyze. Then, you said it was a little bit manual to actually put those pieces together, but maybe on that referral form, if you had been saying, "Who did you hear from?" you would have had it in all in one place, right? But you didn't know until you got to that moment to say, "Oh, that's a piece of data that I think I want to start capturing sooner."
Well, and I think it also reflects what we're talking about here a little bit is the reality of how long it might take to make a sale, right? People talk a lot about, putting so much time into social media and not seeing a lot of results from it because I think the expectation is I'm going to make a post and tell people about something I have in my online shop, and therefore I'm going to see someone order something by clicking this link to go to my online shop. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes they, see that post, realize you have a shop, go to your website, get distracted, put their phone down, remember it in the shower, but forget to come back, and then see you post something again 3 months later and realize, oh, I meant to sign up for their newsletter. Who knows? Like, who knows? Whatever roundabout way. So to be able to then keep track of, I'm rambling really badly right now, but my brain is just going to what we originally talked about in terms of what's actually helpful to know. So being able to see like, oh, Francesco and I were just talking about this, a show that we did last year that maybe the Monday after the show, if we looked at the sales numbers, was okay. But then when we realized, oh, there were 2 dinnerware commissions that came from that show, well, now that show's looking a lot better, you know?
Well, and that's what I was going to say. Similar. That's where it would be similar in pottery is, with that email list or that customer list. And as much as we don't want to do that detail of trying to keep track of who's buying what when, that's a benefit. Is if you're getting that customer list put together, whether you're at the market or from Etsy or wherever you're selling, but including that as part of your data, you can go back. And that's exactly what I was thinking. You might originally not think that this was like a awesome market, but if you go back to the data and really see total dollar sales that came from new customers or customers at that market, it might be like, oh, wait, that is the market I want to make sure I do next year because it did really generate the kind of sales that I wanted to be generating that were long term, right?
Yeah. There was one point this summer where we were looking at sales after a market, and Francesco said something like, oh, well, this portion doesn't count because that was from so and so who has bought a lot of things from us over time. And I was like, that's the part that counts the most because that's who we want more of, that person who shows up to a market because they heard about it from you and is buying, this one platter at this market and this serving bowl at that market and a dinnerware set 6 months later, like that's, at least for us, that's like, yeah, how do we replicate that times 100?
Well, and looking at your customer list, I know this isn't totally what we were talking about, but even with that, like looking at your customer list and saying, who have I generated the highest gross sales from? Or I don't know if it's quantity or dollars. And then starting to maybe you get to know that person, right? And you say, to then say, maybe this is my ideal client and I didn't realize it. So I want to understand some other factors around this customer to see how I start tapping into those like minded people as my customers going forward.
See, now you're speaking my language.
I
Now I'm
know.
like,
I was like, now we're
yeah.
out of my world and going into yours, but it totally fits because then, but it's still the same thing, right? I'm talking financial model, but that's the same thing. What's the output that you want to be able to pull the data from to help you make decisions? It would apply to the customer list as well and the sales associated with customers.
And I want to recognize, I feel like I got really complex really quickly. And I just want to have everybody take a nice deep breath for a second and realize you're not going to have all of this from the get go, but just to even like put it in your brain to think about it so that if somebody starts to grow, if their side hustle, they want to make more of a thing, just to even be aware of to say, like, is this something I want to consider? Is this something I should, even if you are like me and just have a way to track a lot of data, but maybe you're not necessarily doing anything with it right now. It's there when I get around to it, but.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's thinking about, and we sort of touched on this, is that perfect can't get in the way of your progress, right? Just take your progress over perfection and consider just setting up the basic template to start tracking this data is a start versus not having anything at all.
So aside from, we said step one, separate bank accounts from personal to what you're selling and from, whatever personal expenses to what you're buying for to feed the habit, if you will. Which feels accurate for pottery for all of us. Because I think a lot of people's initial goal is like, hey, I want to sell enough to cover what I'm spending, right? So that's step number one in terms of separate accounts. But in terms of, I just forgot the phrase you just used.
Progress over perfection.
Progress over
Yeah.
perfection, but also for the systems, for what we're tracking.
Oh,
Oh, for the data. What would then be are there a couple of things that you feel like, hey, if this is overwhelming, these would be the two systems I would set up, or the one system, or if you do nothing else besides get separate accounts and step two.
so I think it's might be combined. I think it would be the separate accounts. And honestly, it goes back to talking about the cash flow. Getting those separate accounts is going to help you set up some sort of retro look at how has my cash flown so far? What was the beginning balance in June? What was the ending balance and what transactions happened in June to affect that balance? Much revenue did I get? How much expense? I think just looking at that is your step one. And you don't, like I said, I don't think you have to be super detailed. I just think you need to capture the biggest things. What's really driving your revenue? What's really driving your expense? And then starting to look forward and being realistic with yourself. So you can, if you're going to do it in a spreadsheet, map out that spreadsheet and say, today I have this much money in my bank account. Let's put that here as my beginning balance. What do I think is going to happen in the next month? And if the next month is, overwhelming and that's too much detail, then go to the quarter. I'm going to start the quarter January 1st with this balance. Over the quarter, I think I'm going to do this much in sales. Here's the high level expenses that I anticipate. And here's the ending balance. And then when you get to the end of that quarter and you're sitting in April, just go back and look and say, and again, maybe map out your assumptions to know what kind of playbook you said you're going to try to do for a quarter. And in April, let's look back and see what's my ending balance? How close did I come when I was guessing what that ending balance is going to be? If it's more or it's less, let's go back to the assumptions or the playbook and see what was different. Oh, I didn't calculate enough clay, or I didn't anticipate that I wouldn't, I was sick for 3 weeks and I didn't produce anything. So that really impacted the revenue. And then that gives you I think it just gets you more in touch with that flow of that. It's almost like the heartbeat or something of the organization, right? You just start feeling the rhythm of the organization and it's your little organization and you can control it, but it's helping you feel like what's making it stronger, what's kind of pulling away from it, what's slowing it down, what's speeding it up, and helping you get a little bit more in touch with that.
Absolutely. What I hear in that is it's a matter of us kind of separating how we're feeling in any given moment with actually being able to look at just data, like something that, as emotional as money feels for a lot of us, it's just data, like it's just information when you're looking at any kind of financial system, the most simple or the most complex, to where it's just like, okay, this is information historical, this is what I'm hoping for, and where's the gap between the two? And then kind of what do I do with that gap, if there's a gap?
Yeah, well, and no matter what, I mean, there's no judgment from the numbers, the data, right? It's just this was a point in time. We looked in a magic ball and we said, this is what we think is going to happen. It didn't, but that still helps you make decisions going forward. So there's nothing about it that's sad. It just might also be intimidating sometimes. So if it feels like what we've said is, still too much, don't even look at the categories of expense. Look at the bank account and just say, for a quarter, how much money did I bring in? For a quarter, how much money did I spend? If I sustained this, here was the beginning, here's the ending balance. Let's say at the end of December. So I'm starting January with the beginning balance. If I did the same thing as fourth quarter for the first quarter, where would my cash account be in 3 months? And that's just looking at a couple data points. So that might be a little bit less intimidating. I also would caution that if the fourth quarter is your biggest quarter because of all the holidays, you might not want to use that as your first quarter assumption. So maybe there's where you just say, okay, the revenue is going to be 60% of what it was last quarter, and therefore my expenses are going to be 70%. Okay, now do we think that we can manage the next quarter, or is there any interaction that we want to do to change it? Do you think that helps to simplify it that way?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's so many different I'm also acutely aware of that we're talking about a thing to probably a lot of people that are visual learners
Yeah.
in an audio only podcast. So it seems like the appropriate time for me to mention, as salesy as it's going to feel, that you and I are together going to host a masterclass in the community January 20th. Woohoo! Because you
Yay!
do have a full-time job and that is a day off.
Works for me.
So we're going to host a masterclass about financial systems so that we'll have some more visuals in terms of examples of what we're talking about in terms of when we're saying, okay, putting in a starting balance and putting in guesses on revenue or expenses, how that might actually physically look in a very simple spreadsheet, potentially using Google Docs or Excel or something that a lot of people have access to because we have people from all over the world. So, again, not getting into the nitty gritty on taxes because that's legal. And I just said we have people from all over the world. I barely learn enough of how to stay on top of taxes for the United States, let alone other countries. And the fact that state to state is different. I mean, it's exhausting.
Totally. Yeah, that's why I'm not here to offer that information either, because that was no, that's too much. Can I add though? Sorry, I should have said it maybe earlier, but I also think because we talked about this and I was so focused on this quarterly look. I think the other thing is it's not just looking at the next quarter or next month or whatever we want to break it down into, but then it's also going back to what we talked about in the beginning is to say, am I making what I want to make? So I keep going back to it as more of like I'm covering my expenses. But that's a third view of all of this is to say, I think to be able to do this in a way that satisfies me, I need to be having profit, whatever, more revenue than expense of X dollars per month per quarter. So even though we're doing good at guessing, are we on track with what that longer range plan was? And are we headed to that island that says, we are now making $1,000 a quarter. Woohoo! So we'll try to include that too with the master class, but I forgot about it. Sorry.
No worries. No worries. We are recording as we still plan this. So all of it's a work in progress, which should be exciting for people because that's the cool part about the community is that it's not like, okay, we're going to have a master class. We have an idea of what we think is best practices and what will help and people can take actionable steps moving forward. But then the best part is what happens after those master classes. And I think you've been in there to see this happen with Naomi's conversation on communicating value and Allie's on Instagram and all sorts of other things where it's the conversation that happens afterwards, right? What's going to be exciting for this particular topic is other people chiming in to say, okay, well, what's important to me for the system I want is going to be XYZ. How do we make that happen? How should I adjust this? Or, that what's, for lack of a better phrase, group think potential is just, to me, the exciting part instead of, okay, here's a guru, here's a professional, here's what you're supposed to do. Well, if that was the case, everybody would just have profit and loss statements and not be able to make any decisions.
Totally. You should know what has happened and you should have a way to look forward and you should have a way to compare it to what your overall goal is. I look forward to us creating something, bringing it into the community. And yeah, I look most forward to what you talked about, that group think after, like, well, I mean, I see it foreseeable that somebody is going to say, well, I always thought I should track X, Y, and Z. And other people in the community will chime in to be like, oh, I didn't think of that. Or somebody might say, but really, like when you're tracking X, Y, and Z, how's that going to help drive a decision of where you're headed with your business? And that'll give somebody a pause to say, is it worth my time that I should be tracking X, Y, and Z? Is that really driving my business in a different way? That's the most fun when then we can, start having those conversations.
What was it when you and I chatted before we hit record? I was showing you my spreadsheets, which sounds That is not a euphemism. We were literally screen sharing. That's
It
hilarious.
was amazing.
I can't wait until I'm gonna have to send this episode to my old CPA now. She's gonna love that.
Oh yeah. Let's hear
Um,
it.
I was showing you what I have always used, and it was hilarious because you were like, "Well, wait, where's the information on, kind of the objects that you sell, what the forms or whatnot?" And it was so
Yeah.
funny because I realized even just within our own household, the way of what Francesco tracks versus the way of what I track is also completely different.
Yeah.
And that's the same bank account.
Well, then it would probably go to what do you value over what does Francesco value? But I would say overall, yeah, with what you had shown me about the tools that you have to kind of track the financial health for you guys' organization, my only thing was you have like part of it here and part of it here and part of it here. And how fabulous would it have been if we can just get that into one place? And, we talked about that, right? Like if we had it in one place and then even made it into a summary tab on a spreadsheet where you can like, that's the first tab you go into. And it's like, here are the 3 things that I need to know right now so that we can, we've done our check-in. This is our financial check-in. Here we're good, or here, we're not good. What do we want to adjust? So that was my only thing is I was like, oh, I wish it was all in one thing so we could just kind of see everything together. But it's a lot. And especially for what you guys do, a spreadsheet is probably not the right solution. But, I think there's still opportunity that we could get you something to be a little more centralized.
And to normalize this for everyone, because they're going to think we've got some crazy, fancy, overwhelming thing. And they're like, we're absolutely not coming to this masterclass. This sounds exhausting. I have those things separated so that then on the days that I'm not up to see all of the truth of the data, I can just pick and choose what I need to focus on to keep my energy up.
That's fair. That's fair.
I'm still here to say you can have financial systems and bury your head in the sand if you need to, because sometimes we just need to say, I will figure it out. I'm going to keep going because this is what I want to do, even if it's not the most logical life decision.
No, just focus on the revenue. It's all good stuff.
Right. Yeah, I wasn't talking about burying my head in the sand on that at all. That's not what I was talking about ignoring. No, of course not. Spoiler.
Yeah.
If we only focused on that, I would still be doing weddings.
Yeah.
You know.
But I do think that, you had some really good tools that you're using and they do serve a purpose. And I really did appreciate you showing me that and then putting up with my questions and being like, well, this is why I do it this way. That's what I told you is I'm used to seeing it in, my larger organizations, which does not mean it's great. It's just what I'm used to. And so to see it, on the smaller scale and what you're dealing with, that it made more sense to me to understand, like, what are you looking at day to day and what are your challenges? So I appreciated you being patient with all my questions.
Well, I think that's part of why I was so excited about this chat and about what we have coming in the masterclass, because, if somebody listening to this who's, maybe tried to find a local CPA or outsource any kind of accounting, or I know there's some services online now that kind of act as your virtual CFO, if you will.
Yeah, probably.
What's important to someone who's been trained in finance is completely different, I think, at least, to what might be important to a creative person, right? We kind of want to understand, am I still going to be able to pay my bills? Can I take this risk to, what Yvonne did earlier this year? Can I stop making mugs completely and just focus on this creative idea that I have, trying to decide to take a risk like that? Okay, maybe doing it without any access to information, just ignorance is bliss. You run it for it and you figure out a way to make it work. And that's a lot of times something I feel like I hear on the podcasts I was always listening to before I started this. And it was like, okay, but how does that actually work? When you hear I don't know, startup bros or whatever being like, yeah, it was super stressful when we had to remortgage the house in order to fund the business, but now we sold for $1 billion and it was all worth it. I was like, wait a second, back up. How does this really work? What I was excited about was like, you have this understanding of both realms. You understand the pull to be in the basement on a wheel with your hands in mud on the weekends, but then also say, like, oh, okay, I get what the making side of it is like. So let's now help apply some of these structures to make the making side, I don't know, more fruitful.
More fruitful or, make you feel like the making side is also controlling financial outcomes, that you can kind of connect the two through that.
Yeah, I do want to kind of reiterate a little bit too what we said earlier in that it doesn't mean you're having to make every single decision based upon the spreadsheet, but in some ways kind of frees you up to say, oh, okay, I'm going to spend more of my time here creatively exploring this new idea because I know if I just make, I don't know, 100 mugs, they're going to sell for this much. We know we'll be okay. And now I can spend the rest of my time taking a glaze course and starting to make my own glazes because buying commercial glazes was my biggest expense. So now I want to change that. I don't know.
Right.
That's an option.
I mean, it just depends what you want to analyze, right? Like if you're looking at your expenses and you see that that porcelain clay is X amount and you want to start dabbling with a white clay body to see if you can still generate the same amount of sales with a white clay body that's not porcelain, I don't know. How can you model that? How can you look at that and see if that's a lever you want to pull to have the same revenue but for less expense? I don't know.
Oh, that's right. That reminds me because we were talking about the ways in which there's more levers for people to pull than just, I need to earn more money. So therefore I have to work more hours and work harder and make more stuff and, get burnout and exhausted and wind up no longer wanting to make pots. Right? If we have a little bit of this knowledge at our fingertips, we can be more strategic and not just be like, oh, I just have to work harder.
Totally.
There's only so many hours in the day.
Totally. And yes, I think looking at the expenses is important and it does add up, right? These things do add up. But then I know a lot of your guests have also talked about diversifying the revenue stream to, whether it's a Patreon site or something like that that's totally unrelated. But again, other levers that don't mean you have to work 10 times harder just to produce more, but you could find a different way to supplement it or a different way to change your expenses. The expenses are tough though, because most of the expense is going to be you if you want to pay yourself. So that, what value do you put on your time, your effort, your blood, sweat, and tears in there? And then after that, it's going to be just your cost of goods, your clay and your glazes and tools occasionally, right? We keep those for a while. They're not one per pot, but it's really going to be that other stuff. And if you rent a studio space and but looking at those and seeing what other options there are, I think is always important.
Totally. Oh, there's so much more. It's such a big subject.
It is. I feel like that now.
Right? Such a big subject, but I think the overarching thing that we're talking about is like just to get started in some kind of way so that if the day comes you need to pull information, to take a next step, to take a leap even, it's there to be able to make informed decisions. Yeah.
Yeah, I do think so. And just start, like I said, just start somewhere. It'll be information. I know you and I kind of talked about that too. We're like, is it okay to start people on a spreadsheet or should we encourage people to go find an app that seems to track things the way they want to? And honestly, the more I thought, at least for me, everybody's different. If you go through the effort of just putting things on a spreadsheet and starting to really add up, what are all my expenses? What do I really spend money on? That's going to get you in a better place so that then once you do look, I think once you do look for an app, because you're at the point that you want the app to do some of the work for you, then you're going to have a better idea of how to judge that this app is going to really work for you the way you want, because it's going to give you that output and that data in a way that makes sense to you because you're already so in touch with what the inflows and outflows are of your little business.
That, and I would also add, as someone who went through being very not offhand, but just hands off.
Hands off. Yeah, I gotcha.
Oh, goodness gracious. Everyone's going to start to be able to tell when I record in the evening versus when I record in the morning. I went through a period where I was very hands off with the business finances and then have kind of transitioned back into being more hands on. And being more hands-on, having it be more manual also makes you face how you're spending your money again. Like, not just the time you purchased something and you made the decision to make a transaction, but then you see it again later and go like, "Oh, yeah, I did spend that much money on whatever, a Giffen grip that is on the shelf and collecting dust. Okay, this is teaching me I need to really think about, it's just, I think of it like when I was editing the podcast myself and didn't have the help that I have now. I really quickly realized a lot of my tics and my words that I repeat and things that I wanted to try and consciously be better about because I had to face it all over again, right? I don't know if that metaphor makes sense.
Well, no, I think that was insightful the way you said that about going back and looking at your expenses. It makes you kind of face them again, but probably from a different light. So it's not in the moment of I need this or I want this, right? Now it's did I need this? And they do add up. Just like
Mhm.
just like in our own personal accounts, the expenses do add up and the Starbucks coffees, then you realize how many Starbucks coffees you bought over the last month. Same thing with a business expense. You're going to say, oh, you know. So I think it gets, I don't know, for me, it's that tangibility. And I know you can't physically touch the numbers, but it feels more tangible to me when I understand what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Which also brings us full circle. I will try to land the plane here because in the beginning you mentioned even like for the people who are envisioning or dreaming of quitting that job and doing something full time, when you said in the very beginning, like being able to back into the numbers, it immediately made me think about how astonishing it is that you can kind of pay yourself a relatively small amount of money. I mean, you've seen my numbers now, and yet need to earn what I would say is effectively 3 times the amount. And okay, that's not an exact math for anyone to use specifically because it's going to depend on their cost of living and all sorts. But if we had to say a universal statement, roughly speaking, it's basically 3 times.
Yeah, I think that's close. When you think about the expenses that you're going to have, and then you think about the taxes that you're going to owe, unfortunately, and all the other things that you need to take off that revenue to get to the number to do that backwards planning. So I do think that backwards planning is key in there, more so just so you can kind of gauge if you're even what's your time frame, just gauge where are you at.
Yeah. I also think it demystifies a little bit a lot of the things online when people talk about like how to have a 6-figure year and all of these numbers that get thrown around with so many online educators. I just used air quotes, because what does 6 figures mean? Are we talking 6 figures gross or are we talking 6 figures net? Because those are two. Are we talking 6 figures paying yourself or as she shakes her head back and forth, no? Or are we talking 6 figures as a business? It's a phrase that sounds so important and sounds so impressive until you start to do the math and then you're like, "Oh wow, that doesn't get us very far." Spoiler.
But that's what
So,
helps you to kind of make that good choice as you move forward, is at least feel like you've thought through those things.
totally. Awesome. Well, there was so much more we could keep going down the rabbit hole on, but we're also going to flesh out more of this in the community even before the masterclass happens. We're asking some questions. We're getting to know people's specific, what, as you said at the very beginning, it's a lot of asking ourselves the question of what we personally are interested in and what's most helpful for ourselves in our own unique situation and build the resources from there. So there will be visuals. They'll just be in our favorite place online.
Yep. I'm looking forward to it.
Yay! Speaking, though, also of Glencairns and your actual pots, where would you like to send people to see what you're making and not talk about spreadsheets, but talk about clay?
Well, you can find me on Instagram at Seanin Ceramics. As simple as that, Seanin, Seanin. Not the easiest name.
But not that hard once you learn it either.
No, once you learn it, it's easy. It's just that first impression. You're like, huh?
Fair enough. I mean, anybody who knows a Siobhan should be perfectly fine to spell
Yep.
Seanin.
Oh, yeah, it's not nearly as gnarly as that.
Okay, so clearly there is so much more that we could still talk about when it comes to finances and financial systems. And yes, I know we did not even touch anything by way of taxes, which is always everyone's very natural number one concern. The hard part with that is that taxes are literally different everywhere, not just country to country, but also, taking the US for an example, because that's clearly what I know, when we moved from Chicago to Milwaukee, that involves crossing the state line from Illinois to Wisconsin, which meant everything was different. We moved 90-minute drive north, and I had to relearn sales tax. In fact, looking only at Wisconsin, sales tax in Milwaukee as a city is different than sales tax in Milwaukee County. And that's different than, let's say, Sheboygan County, where we had a show last summer, and therefore had a different sales tax rate just for those 2 days of that show. Yeah. All this to say, we weren't trying to avoid taxes on purpose to be less than helpful or to hold back information only for the masterclass. No, not at all. With nearly 100 people from all over the world in the community, it is literally impossible to dig into exact tax needs. Also, because how taxes are handled is going to depend on what kind of business entity you are. For example, sole proprietor, LLC, S Corp, and I don't even know what those same equivalents might be called in other countries. But anyway, I don't mean to say all of that to get you overwhelmed all over again. What I can say is that if you are at least starting to track your income and your expenses, whether with the system and the spreadsheet that Seanin will be teaching everyone on the 20th, or through your own system, at least tracking and having that data easily accessible will put you in a much easier place to talk to a local professional or to spend a lot of time on Google figuring out your specific needs for your specific business and geographic location. Trust me. Categorizing income and expenses is the largest time suck piece of tax preparation if you're not doing it on a regular basis, no matter where you are in the world. I promise. That much I do know, without a doubt. As I said at the beginning, there's only so much information that's helpful to listen to when it comes to financial systems. And I'm betting that most of you, like myself, are more visual learners in general. So we have a lot of resources coming soon to the community for our Financial Systems Masterclass, and heaps of more conversations, supporting Q&A sessions, and let's actually start using this spreadsheet, get this stuff done, and make sure we get it done next month too, co-working hangouts. So come join us by signing up at makersplaybook.com/community. From my own personal experience, I can say with utmost certainty that the things that feel the most overwhelming, like financial systems, are exponentially easier when done alongside understanding, supportive colleagues and friends. Because as always, together, we've got this. Audio post-production of this podcast is made possible by help from Christy Kotzvan, with promotional material assistance from Queenie Maliki. The Maker's Playbook podcast is recorded on the original homelands of the Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee people, where the people of Wisconsin's sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Oneida, and Mohican nations remain present. Until next time, my friends, go get back to making your dreams a reality. Because together, we've got this.
This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.